So this paper is entitled All the Way Down and Up, and it is horrifically provisional and contingent. And it is a bit of a thought experiment that is not yet fully formed and possibly never will be, so you'll have to bear with me. So all the way down and up, transcellularities, membranous entanglements, and a legal imaginary for the planetary. So a central theme in this paper is going to be the relationship between transcellularities, membranous entanglements, and what I'm calling defamiliarization after Rosie Braidotti. And this is the image that started the whole trouble. So writing a fiction as legal method, Lim argues that both radical imagination and relational imagining with our more than human kin are needed to address the interconnected challenges of the Anthropocene, such as extinction, climate change, and inequity. Yet, as Bulow and Sterling highlight, environmental law remains in a one-world paradigm, a paradigm where human use of the environment is premised on determining allowable harm rather than on obligations to or relationships with more than human nature. Lim adds, if only there were a way to simultaneously awaken our plural selves while extending our imaginations and imaginaries. And while Lim draws on fiction as legal method for this purpose, I'm inspired by this image of a cellular landscape cross-section through a eukaryotic cell by Evan Ingersoll and Gail McGill. The image apparently provides the most detailed model of a human cell to date and captures the lively complexity of life at a microscale. The eukaryotic cell is membranous. It has a membrane-bound nucleus, numerous membrane-bound organelles, including the mitochondria themselves as complex as tiny cities, and rod-shaped chromosomes. The transcellular drives at the transit or drift or seeping of substances through the cell, a passage through membranes, in contrast to paracellular transport, where substances pass through the intercellular space between the cells. For the purposes of this present reflection, biological technicalities are not as important as the invocation of the idea of movements across and through membranous layers of life as a kind of drift or seeping or porosity at the microscale and beneath, that simultaneously implicates intimacies and proximities at the planetary scale. For me, this image and the thought of the transcellular and the multiple transcellularities that it evokes inspires the possibility that one way to awaken our plural selves in a more radical and relational imagining with more than human kin might be through responding to a more scientifically and aesthetically defamiliarizing sense of self and of what and who is here, all the way down and up again. So I want to position thoughts about planetary responsibilities in relation to some initial evocations emerging from the idea of the transcellular as a theoretical figuration with which to contribute to the search for renewing forms of what Lorraine Code has called processes of responsibilization. So the present thought experiment is set explicitly against Law's modernist imaginary, including its sticky presuppositions concerning subject-object relations and the subject at the centre in reference to which those objects have generally been constructed. This subject at the centre is still, after all, fundamental to the structure of Law's one-world paradigm. Accordingly, in this paper, I aim towards a defamiliarization of that central subject precisely because it is still stubbornly pivotal to Law's ongoing mediation of the more than human world as object, and is concomitantly pivotal to ongoing processes of objectification at work in the unevenness and injustices of the contemporary global order, including climate injustice and organised forms of planetary irresponsibility. In Braidotti's words, defamiliarization is a sobering process by which the knowing subject evolves from the normative vision of the self he or she had become accustomed to. But to defamiliarise the subject is also to defamiliarise the world of that subject, for as Lenin puts it, our mode of embodied subjectivity is an imaginary embodiment in an imaginary world. And such imaginaries are not, as Lenin points out, changed by arguments about truth and falsity, so much as they're changed by alternative imagined configurations that need to make both cognitive and affective sense. What might the image of the cell, with its intimations of multiple mysterious intimacies revealed by the sight organs of advanced science and rendered in such visually arresting detail, offer as theoretical potential for cognitive and affective sense-making towards a defamiliarised self? Might it hold meaning-generative possibilities for a sobering appreciation and related ethical reappraisal of multitudinous intimacies that explode Law's humanist imaginary, not just at skin level, but also far beneath and beyond it? In the contemporary planetary condition, defamiliarising imaginaries could scarcely be more strategically necessary or urgently required. Plumwood has argued that if our species does not survive the ecological crisis, it will probably be due to our failure to work out new ways to live with the Earth, to rework ourselves. We will go onwards in a different mode of humanity, or not at all. This going onwards requires Western science and philosophy, as Plumwood sees it, to address two important tasks. The first is to resituate the human in ecological terms, and the second is to resituate the non-human in ethical terms. These two tasks are also inevitably urgently salient for Law. Law is a powerful site of active processes of responsibilisation and of ongoing legitimated irresponsibilisation. And it seems to me that there is no possibility of going onwards in a different mode of humanity without the radical imagination and relational imagining with our more than human kin now required of Law that Lim identifies. To exercise this radical imagination and relational imagining, to resituate the human in ecological terms and to resituate the non-human in ethical terms, is to attempt nothing short of a reversal of what Morton calls the Great Severing. Law's ongoing assumption of Cartesian subject-object relations, including in human rights, environmental and climate law, reflects Law's continuing refusal to embrace, or possibly even to see, that as Singh's Feral Atlas project puts it, everyday human life is always a multi-species effort, and that other species, as well as non-living things, make it possible to be human. While a wide range of critical legal theoretical accounts problematise the central subject of law as a dominant structure of the existing legal imaginary, this subject, in tacit ways, still centrally conditions law's institutional production of planetary responsibilities. Law's subject at the centre seems, if anything, particularly influential in the domain of planetary responsibilisation. It haunts the juridical aspirations and operating assumptions of Earth system law and undergirds the neoliberal eco-governmentality expressed in panoptic initiatives such as the World Watch Institute, as Timothy Luke has argued. It lurks in Law's Promethean aspirations for telluric planetary governmentality. It is also still pivotal to processes of planetary spoliation, as well as to processes of subjectivisation, subjectification and objectification, characterising the history and the present of the international legal order. And as Donna Haraway has observed, the question of who or what is an object turns out to be precisely what world history has been about. Given the stakes, it seems strategically urgent to defamiliarise this subject at the centre and to produce an alternative imaginary. And it's in service of this task that I respond to the image of the cell. In no particular order as yet, I play with some provisional, very provisional threads. How might a defamiliarized self explode humanism at skin level and beneath and beyond? Embodied life is quite unlike Law's imaginary of a relatively autonomous, bounded, quasi-disembodied subject. Thinking with transcellularity suggests that the non-unitary relational subject that Braidotti reaches for in her production of post-human subjectivities, a subject with the capacity for multiple and non-linear connections, has more than merely a capacity for such connections. Such multiple and non-linear connections are an ontic inevitability, inescapable, and the image of the cell intimates an embodied self indeed as a thoroughly transcellular assemblage, not merely multiply and non-linearly connected with, but interactively co-constituted with and by multiple human and more than human collaborators. These include the microscopic cellular, subcellular, viral, bacterial, and other intra-assemblages that make up what Bennett has recently called the it in the I. The image alludes to micro-collaborations, revealing the human being both in a cognitive and an affective register as being always and already a more than human interspecies collaboration. The thought of the it in the I is not limited, however, to the microscale in the interiority of bodies. As a theoretical figuration, the transcellular intimates porous relationalities at multiple scales, evoking the material flows, transit, affects, and interpermeations of the planetary condition more pervasively. This kind of I is thoroughly entangled in a vast, coextensive field of emergence, such that, as Bennett suggests, it's possible to recognise, in my own experience of self, a Whitmanian myself that is always amidst a procreant process without beginning or end. Might the making visible of the complex cellular and other forms of biotic and abiotic intelligences and communicative signalling communities in and beyond the body evoke a quasi-Copernican dissonance, defamiliarizing the unitary self? Is it possible that such defamiliarization and its deeper implications might draw Western humans and Western ontoepistemology into an overdue awareness of procreant planetary processes demanding a more profound sense of ethical proximity? I turn now more explicitly to the imagined scale of the global and the planetary. In her book Bodily Natures, Science, Environment and the Material Self, Alemo describes the contemporary context for ethics as being not merely social but material, as the emergent, ultimately unmappable landscapes of interacting biological, climatic, economic and political forces that make up the contemporary planetary condition. These landscapes are encountered through transcorporeality, which Alemo describes as a thinking across bodies that opens up a mobile space that acknowledges the often unpredictable and unwanted actions of human bodies, non-human creatures, ecological systems, chemical agents, and other actors. The trans of transcorporeality demands, says Alemo, more capacious epistemologies for forging ethical and political positions that can contend with late 20th and early 21st century realities. It demands modes of analysis that travel through the entangled territories of material and discursive, natural and cultural, biological and textual. Transcorporeality demands an epistemological expansion also capable of embracing particular moments of confusion and contestation that occur when individuals and collectives must contend not only with the materiality of their very selves, but with the often invisibly hazardous landscapes of risk society, and must negotiate the incalculable, interconnected material agencies that erode even our most sophisticated modes of understanding. Such complexity, says Alemo, requires the sensory organs of science, theories, experiments, measuring instruments, in order to become visible or interpretable as hazards at all. Such sensing, indeed, becomes a prerequisite for even surveying the landscape of the self. Science has paid increasing attention to just how far the risks now conditioning planetary relations transit across and through the cellular structures of all living things. Even the public lay imagination is beginning to encounter images and data suggesting just how porously open bodies are to the planetary transit of toxins. Bodies are also, however, and less visibly perhaps, membranous receptors for circulations at the cellular level to economic, political, juridical, cultural, climatic, spatial, chemical, viral, molecular, racial, sexual, colonial, extractive, appropriate, emissive, calculative, regulatory, and other unlistable flows of affect. Set against the illegibility of the self in the risk horizon of the planetary condition, the possibility of the visibility of the cellular potentially signals the depths of the intimacies of entanglement that, once seen, demand the more responsible, less confident epistemologies necessary for thinking with planetary responsibilization. Relatedly, given the challenges of illegibility, it seems all the more urgent to open out the visibility and audibility of a world of worlds. This world of worlds would include a multiplicity of world-making practices, non-Western onto-epistemologies, and a plethora of other perceptual openings. Transcellularity, as part of this reaching for a world of worlds, might emphasise how all bodies, including my own, are caught up in the most proximate of relations in planetary flows. The very rain that falls onto the ground and circulates in the Earth's hydrological cycles, becoming watery vapours, flows, falls and evaporations also, in some important and meaningful sense, circulates through my cells. I daily absorb water that has passed through multiple other bodies, and that watery flux, as it arrives through my mouth or is absorbed by my porous skin, affects the multitudinous and ancient interrelationalities of cellular and subcellular communities and communicative collaborations of my own corporeal assemblage. Mitochondria and microbiomes communicate through chemical and hormonal signalling technologies older than human science, while viral and bacterial microentities negotiate ongoing processes of ingestion, digestion, and excretion. The urine I pass transmits to uncountable unseen others the material traces and residues of multiple choices, including production and consumption patterns that are most certainly not just my own, although my psychophysical states also pass on their distinctive chemical and hormonal residues and markers. These multiple exchanges, and so many more, express ceaseless continuities and ruptures of a vast coextensive materiality, folded into which are meta, meso, micro and nanoscale actants and dynamics. Transcellularity on this register draws attention to the sheer intimacy of the risk flows and agentic patterns of the contemporary planetary condition, all the way down and all the way up. Intimacies lie at the heart of the sensing invited by transcellularity. In this, transcellularity chimes with a growing awareness of the intimacies revealed by scientific evidence of the systemic effects of climate warming, ocean acidification, biodiversity collapse, and so on. All life on Earth is forced together and apart in new, disruptive ways by the dynamic pressures of a heating world. climate crisis is generating multiple new kinds of proximity and encounter, making new alliances and new conflicts inevitable. Such intimacies also produce defamiliarizing effects in the experience of an increasingly non-negotiable, uneven collective encounter with vast complexities and life-threatening exigencies. Indeed, the Anthropocene signals not only the urgency of defamiliarizing the familiar Western sense of self and world, but, as Bennett puts it, finding an alternative to the object as a way of encountering the non-human world. It also, and this I think is important for legal approaches to planetary responsibilization to face up to, signals the urgency of remembering impotentiality. Colebrook has argued that the fact that we forget our impotentiality, that we treat humans as factual beings with a normality that dictates action, has reached crisis point in modernity, especially as we increasingly suspend the thought of our fragility for the sake of ongoing efficiency. The human normality that dictates action is breaking down in front of our eyes. A new, shifting, unpredictable normality, complete with defamiliarizations born of dizzying shifts and challenges, including the breakthrough insights and productions of cutting-edge science, confront law, demanding nothing less than the undoing of its most cherished onto-epistemological assumptions. Central to this undoing is the ethical challenge of cultivating, as Bennett puts it, the ability to discern non-human vitality, to become perceptually open to it. Perceptual openings include shifts of perception in the affective register. Indeed, affective shifts are fundamental for the generation of a turn in the dominant imaginary. The image of this cell as just one small perceptual opening hints at transcellular intimacies, evoking intimacies at multiple sites and scales. Transcellularity, moving as a theoretical trope beyond the confines of biotic cellularity to include abiotic actants of multiple kinds, hints at what's here as an emergence of intimacies, a chaotic network of habitual and non-habitual connections, always in flux, always reassembling in different ways, intimacies moving all the way down and all the way up, and problematizing that duality itself. Tracing these threads requires, at least in part, an act of imaginative empathic sensitivity, able to open a felt sense of outward boundness, as Braidotti might put it. Empathic threads call for affirmative political energies mobilised in support of new and sometimes unexpected solidarities, always alert to exclusions and closures. There is an urgent need for more capacious epistemologies, new modes of attunement to the most visceral and planetary of matters and circulations of power. We now know, for example, that plastics manufactured in one place are ingested by cellular bodies in and of bodies elsewhere, that Teflon, for example, invades the fleshy communities in and of polar bears, seals, birds and fish in the Arctic, that fish imbibe microplastics which in turn circulate through numerous animal and human-animal bodies in ingestive cycles everywhere, that consumer waste of multiple kinds is excreted and transported in and across ecosystems, transiting predictably and unpredictably in vectors of affect everywhere. Such circulations are inevitably also circulations of power. International policy decisions, international legal structures, economic and political dynamics, governance technologies, and more operate in and through such transcellular intimacies all the way up and all the way down, and in the end, transiting toxins, viruses, nutrients, microparticles, chemicals, plastics, fluids, airborne pollutants, soil-borne pathogens, digital accent, legal decisions, regulatory failures, policy choices, space debris in near-Earth orbital space, and more, endlessly more, make up a flux of ceaselessly predictable and unpredictable patterns of convergence and conflict, and more. Such planetary intimacies demand new modes of attunement and deep alertness to the politics of epistemic location. Law, in response, is called to a new epistemic humility, not just in response to the scientific decentering of law's epistemic centre, but also in response to the need for overt and respectful attention to this vast world of worlds. At present, despite the sheer necessity of responding to such intimacies and to their demand for pluralities and for less confident epistemologies, environmental law and climate governance remain wedded to the dominant juridical fantasy of the one world, the subject at the centre, and to law's minimalist commitment to determining allowable harm. Indeed, as Roncancio has argued, law continues to assert its own self-understanding as a system of norms made by humans to regulate human conduct in relation to an externally existing natural world, thereby continuing to insist on a separation between law and life processes. This, Roncancio argues, results in the almost inevitable construction of something called nature as yet another abstract legal subject. What would it be like for law to embrace epistemic contingency as an explicit central commitment, the kind of contingency for which even subject-object positions are explicitly constructed for a particular purpose from a particular perspective along the lines suggested by Barad? What would it be like for law to embrace the idea, along with Bennett, that while human beings will inevitably continue to distinguish things from persons, it will be vital to build responsibilities on the basis that the sort of world we live in makes it constantly possible for these two sets of kinds to exchange properties? Planetary responsibilization, in the light of transcellularity, demands law's responsiveness to proximities between bodies of all kinds and calls for legal ontoepistemologies capacious enough to embrace fluidity, complexity, and rapid change. It calls for theories and practices of sustained and flexible attentiveness to the multiple, porously open transit ways through which planetary and global circulations unevenly draw entities, systems, and relationalities of all kinds into exposure to each other, all the way up and all the way down. Epistemic location becomes an explicit issue here, for one aspect of law's role will be the need to respect the importance of the question asked by Haraway of who we are bound up with and in what ways. Transcellularity opens this question out in the context of intimacies simultaneously planetary and visceral, and a transcellular theory of law would involve making detectable precisely the previously unnoticed intimacies, inter- and intradependencies, and circulations of affect and vulnerability so often selectively excised by the dominant legal ontoepistemology of mastery and control. Planetary responsibility would also necessarily be pluralized into multiply situated processes of planetary responsibilization, for, in the final analysis, such processes, central in a way to law's role, cannot, in the end, belong to law alone. Law, like its central subject, now requires a radical defamiliarization and a deep and humbling confrontation with its own distributed materiality, impotentiality, and limits. Returning again to Plumwood, law is part of the great reworking required by the ecological crisis, and not least because of its role in organised irresponsibilization. It is past time for law, along with science, philosophy, and other disciplines, to resituate the human in ecological terms and to resituate the non-human in ethical terms. Transcellularity points just one sensing feeler towards a defamiliarizing imaginary of self and world. And defamiliarizations of self and world are vital, for again, with Plumwood, if our species does not survive the ecological crisis, it will probably be due to our failure to work out new ways to live with the earth, to rework ourselves. We will go onwards in a different mode of humanity, or not at all.